hammer fell with the rhythm of a dying heart. Clang, clang, clang. In the deepest corner of Grey Marrow, a border town where the mud never fully thawed and the wind screamed like a wounded beast through the valley, the forge of Caelan Vance was the only place that knew the meaning of heat. It was a miserable structure, built from rotting pine and heavy river stones that wept moisture when the coal fires roared. The air inside was thick, tasting of sulfur, charcoal, and the bitter, sharp tang of cooled iron. Caelan Vance was 42 years old, but his spine carried the curvature of a man who had lived 3 lifetimes. He was thin, his shoulders slightly uneven from an old shoulder joint that had set wrong after a winter raid 12 years ago. His left leg did not bend correctly at the knee, causing him to drag his foot across the dirt floor with a heavy, scraping sound that the townsfolk used to know he was coming. His wool tunic was burned through at the chest, patched with rough, dark burlap that smelled of grease. He did not look like a man who possessed secrets. He looked like a man whom life had ground into dust, leaving only the calluses on his palms and the rhythmic movement of his right arm to prove he was still breathing. Across from him, resting on a 3-legged stool that shook every time the hammer hit the anvil, sat his 15-year-old apprentice, a mute boy named Jory, whom Caelan had found freezing under a merchant wagon 3 winters back. Jory was carefully filing the rough edges of a horseshoe, his knuckles blue from the draft leaking through the gaps in the timber wall. Between them was nothing but a cracked clay bowl containing 3 cold, shriveled potatoes and a small jar of coarse salt. Supper. Then the wind stopped screaming. It did not die down. It was blocked. The heavy oak door of the forge, reinforced with scrap iron braces that Caelan had hammered himself, did not just open. It groaned as a massive weight leaned against it, pushing the snowdrift aside. The cold that entered the room was immediate, a sharp blade of white frost that instantly turned the heat of the hearth into thin, wispy steam. A shadow filled the doorway. It was too wide for a human, too tall for the low lintel of the shop, and wrapped in the tattered, salt-stained remains of a northern war cloak. The color of the skin beneath the hood was a dark, bruised green, mottled by frostbite and marked with the cruel, jagged lines of ritual demotion. Every movement in the forge ceased. Jory's file slipped, scratching against the iron horseshoe with a screech that set teeth on edge. The boy froze, his eyes widening as he stared at the floor, his small frame trembling. It was Mora the Fallen, the disgraced general of the Iron Grip Vanguard, a name that had traveled across the borderline in whispers of blood, siege fire, and broken oaths. 3 weeks ago, she had commanded 4,000 spears at the siege of Redreach. Tonight, she stood in a human blacksmith shop 6 miles deep into enemy territory, her armor stripped of its brass sigils, her chest plate gouged by the halberds of her own kin, and her name erased from the great song of the northern clans. Her left tusk was sheared off near the gum line, a fresh, raw wound that still wept gray fluid into the frost of her chin. The right tusk remained, long, sharp, and curved like a crescent moon, casting a long shadow across her scarred cheekbone. She stepped inside. The dirt floor, packed tight by years of human boots, compressed under her massive weight. She wore no weapons at her hip. Her greatsword had been shattered on the judgment stone before her exile, but her presence alone filled the room with the suffocating pressure of a battlefield. She did not look at Caelan. She did not look at the boy. Her yellow, bloodshot eyes scanned the smoke-stained rafters, measuring the structural support, the distance to the rear forge chimney, and the 2 heavy iron poker rods resting by the coal bin. A general assessing a cage. Finally, her gaze dropped to Caelan Vance. "The iron," she said. Her voice was a low, grating rumble, like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. It was a throat ruined by screaming orders through siege smoke, now reduced to a harsh whisper. "You work it?" Kalen did not lift his hammer from the anvil. He kept it rested against the hot metal, his rough, soot-darkened fingers curled loosely around the ashwood handle. He did not pull his shoulders back. He did not look at the heavy iron poker rods she had just eyed. He simply looked at her face, matching her yellow gaze with his own dull gray eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen enough storms to know that running only made you die tired. "I work what people pay for," Kalen said softly. His tone lacked the trembling terror that usually greeted her kind in human lands. It was flat, dry, and steady as the stone beneath his feet. "Horseshoes, mostly. Plowshares when the spring comes. Hinges for doors that don't want to stay shut." Mora reached beneath her tattered cloak, her massive hand green and thick with knuckles that had broken human ribs like dry twigs, pulled loose a heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. She dropped it onto the wooden workbench near the door. The wood cracked under the impact, a small splinter breaking off and drifting into the dirt. The cloth fell away, revealing the remains of her gauntlet. It was a magnificent piece of old northern craftsmanship, heavy steel plates articulated with thick ox hide, designed to protect the forearm of a warrior who swung an axe for 14 hours without stopping. But the steel was crushed. A heavy war hammer had struck the wrist guard, collapsing the iron plates inward, flattening the inner track where the leather straps met the flesh. If she wore it now, the metal would cut into her veins until her hand went black. "Fix it," Mora commanded. It was not a request. It was the residual habit of a woman who had spent 20 years telling kings where to die. "The tracking is bent. The inner plate is biting the bone. I have 3 silver marks." She placed 3 small, jagged pieces of silver on the table beside the broken gauntlet. They were not human coins. They were raw northern silver, hacked off a ceremonial chain with a dull knife. The edges were dark with dried orc blood. Kalen looked at the silver. Then he looked at the gauntlet. He dragged his bad leg behind him, the heavy scrape thud echoing in the small room as he moved toward the workbench. Jory watched him, his knuckles white against the horseshoe he was still holding like a shield. Kalen picked up the gauntlet. His hands were small compared to the massive piece of war steel, but he handled it with a strange, immediate familiarity. His thumb did not slide along the decorative engraving on the outside. Instead, his fingers went straight to the interior lining, pressing against the hidden iron rivets that held the articulation together. He knew exactly where the strain was. He knew exactly how the metal had folded. "This isn't common iron," Kalen muttered, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the coal fire. "This is high-ridge ore, smelted with bone ash to keep it from snapping in the northern frost. If I put this in a regular human fire, the carbon will burn out. It'll turn to slag before I can strike it twice." Mora's yellow eyes narrowed, her single remaining tusk twitching against her upper lip. "You know the high-ridge ore, human?" "I know metal," Kalen said, his expression unchanging. He set the gauntlet down. "And I know that 3 silver marks won't buy the charcoal I need to bring the hearth up to the heat this steel demands. It takes 3 days of continuous blowing just to make the embers white enough to soften high-ridge iron." Mora took a step closer. The tip of her leather boot touched the edge of Kalen's shadow on the dirt floor. She was a foot taller than him, her broad shoulders blocking out the faint light coming from the forge window. The smell of her traveled with her, the scent of wet iron, old blood, and the bitter pine sap grease her people used to keep their skin from cracking in the sleet. "I have nothing else," she whispered, her voice dangerous, the promise of violence vibrating in the marrow of her words. "The silver is all that remains of my house. Fix it, Blacksmith, or I will take your hearth, and I will use your hands to hammer it myself." Jory gasped, dropping his horseshoe onto the stone with a loud clang. The boy scrambled backward, his back hitting the timber wall, his eyes darting toward the door. But Kalen Vance did not flinch. He did not move his hand toward his tools. He simply stood before the disgraced general, his posture slightly slumped, his bad leg bearing most of his weight. He looked at the 3 pieces of silver on the table, then reached out his right hand, his fingers touching the metal. As he moved his arm, the sleeve of his wool tunic slipped back 3 inches. It was a small movement, a momentary displacement of cloth in the dim firelight. But Mora's eyes, trained to spot the slight quiver of a hidden blade or the muscle tension of an archer in the brush, caught it instantly. Along the inside of Kalen's right wrist, stretching up into the thick flesh of his forearm, was a scar. It was not the smooth, shiny pink mark of a forge burn or the jagged silver line of a hunting accident. It was a cross-hatched, systematic series of deep, pale indentations, the unmistakable scar left by an orcish iron shackle, the kind used in the deep iron mines of the Broken Ridge clan to keep human labor from lifting their hands against the guards. A branding mark that had been worn for years, cut so deep into the skin that the hair would never grow there again. Mora stared at his wrist. Her breath caught in her massive chest, a low, sudden intake of air that rattled against her throat. She looked from the scar up to Kalen's face, her yellow eyes searching his features with a sudden, sharp intensity that had nothing to do with the gauntlet or the silver. "You were in the northern pits," she said, the anger in her voice replaced by a strange, heavy stillness. "The ridge mines. 5, maybe 10 winters ago." Kalen pulled his sleeve down, his movements slow and deliberate, covering the pale marks once more. He picked up the broken gauntlet and turned his back on her, walking back toward the anvil with his uneven, scraping stride. "A lot of men were in the pits, General," Kalen said, his voice dropping into that quiet, unmovable rhythm. "Most of them stayed there. The ones who came back don't talk about the weather up north." He set the crushed steel onto the anvil and picked up a heavy tongs set. "Jory, blow the bellows. We need the white coal. The general is staying for the night." Mora did not sit back down on the stool. She remained standing by the door, her single tusk catching the red glow of the rising fire as Jory began to pump the leather bellows. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer the silence of a predator and its prey in a small room. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a long-buried history, shifting beneath the floorboards like ice before the thaw. And outside, the blizzard returned with a vengeance, burying the tracks that led to the forge under 6 inches of fresh, unmarked white. The white coal did not burn like regular wood. It did not snap or pop with cheerful sparks. Instead, under the steady, rhythmic wheeze of Jory's leather bellows, the high-density northern anthracite glowed with a terrifying, silent intensity. The core of the hearth turned from a deep cherry red to a blinding, star-like white that forced the shadows to the very edges of the room. The heat became a physical weight, pressing against the skin until sweat mixed with soot, dripping down Kalen's hollow cheeks. Kalen Vance stood before the fire, his face illuminated by the harsh glare. In his right hand, he held the long-handled iron tongs, their jaws clamped tightly around the crushed steel of Mora's gauntlet. He did not rush. A lesser smith would have thrust the piece straight into the hottest part of the flame, eager to get the work over with. But Kalen held it at the margin, letting the heat creep into the high ridge ore slowly, grain by grain. Mora stood 3 paces back, her massive arms folded across her chest plate. Her yellow eyes remained fixed on Kalen's hands. She had seen the finest armorers of the capital, orcs who worked beneath the banners of the High King, using blood-tempered hammers and magma-fed troughs, but the way this broken human held the steel was different. He did not look like a master forcing his will upon the metal. He looked like a doctor listening to the shallow breathing of a dying patient. "You are holding it too far from the heart," Mora rumbled, her voice cutting through the steady roar of the bellows. "High ridge iron must be broken by force while it is white hot, or it remembers its old shape and cracks." Kalen did not look up from the flame. His grip on the tongs remained steady. "If I put it in the heart now, the exterior plate will reach melting point before the inner lining thaws." "Your kin don't just forge steel, General. They layer it. Soft iron on the inside to cushion the shock of an axe blow. Hard, bone-crushed steel on the outside to turn a blade. If the transition between the two layers gets too hot, too fast, they separate. And the next time you drop your wrist to parry, the gauntlet will split like a dry reed." Mora's single tusk twitched. A cold realization settled behind her eyes. "A slave in the ridge mines clears the stone from the tracks. He does not sit at the master's furnace. He does not learn the dual weave of the vanguard." "Who taught you to read the layers, Blacksmith?" Kalen dragged his bad leg forward, a heavy scrape thud against the dirt, and finally plunged the gauntlet into the blinding white core of the hearth. "The mines were a loud place, General," Kalen said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar, unmovable flat tone. "But if you sit in the dark long enough, you learn to separate the sounds. You learn the difference between the sound of iron being beaten into a shovel and the sound of steel being hardened for a warlord. I spent 4 winters in those pits. You tend to pick up the language when the alternative is a whip across your kidneys." He turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at her. The firelight caught the deep lines around his eyes, lines carved by decades of smoke and silent endurance. "Jory, hold the rhythm. Don't let the air slacken now." The mute boy nodded fiercely, his small body leaning fully into the wooden lever of the bellows. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving, but he did not slow down. He knew that in Kalen's shop, the fire was sacred. If a piece of metal was ruined because the air failed, it wasn't just a loss of silver, it was an insult to the iron itself. Kalen pulled the gauntlet from the fire. The steel was no longer dark, it glowed with a terrifying liquid luminescence, shifting between yellow and white. He brought it down onto the massive iron anvil with a heavy, practiced swing. Before the metal could cool even a fraction of a degree, Kalen picked up his small, short-handled rounding hammer. He did not strike with the explosive, bone-shattering force of an orc warrior. His swings were light, rapid, and incredibly precise. Tink, tink, clang, tink. He was tapping the collapsed interior plate, not trying to flatten it out in one blow, but coaxing the iron back into its original track. Every strike was calculated to relieve the stress in the metal without fracturing the delicate crystalline structure of the high-ridge ore. Mora watched the hammer move. Her eyes drifted down from the iron to Kalen's right arm. With every strike, his sleeve rode up, exposing the deep, cross-hatched shackle scars on his wrist. But as the muscles in his forearm flexed under the strain of the work, she noticed something else. Beneath the shackle marks, near the thick tendon that ran down to his thumb, was an old, faint discoloration. It was a silver-gray patch of skin, circular and slightly raised, looking like the remnant of a severe localized frostbite that had rotted the flesh down to the muscle before healing over. It was the kind of wound a man got when he held bare iron against his skin in the middle of a northern black frost. Her yellow eyes widened slightly as a memory, sharp and unbidden, cut through her military focus. 6 winters ago, during the great purge of the northern clans, before she had risen to the rank of general, Mora had been a hunted outcast. Betrayed by her own brother, her squad slaughtered in the snow, she had fled into the frozen desolation of the Cragmarrow Peaks. For 3 long, bitter winters, she had lived like a beast in a shallow limestone cave, her body broken by infected wounds, her pride reduced to ash. She had survived on nothing but frozen lichen and the occasional mountain hare. But during the worst blizzards, the nights when the temperature dropped low enough to split stone, she would wake up to find a bundle of dry ironwood logs stacked silently just outside the mouth of her cave. Sometimes there would be a small clay jar of melted lard mixed with pine needles to rub into her infected joints. She had never seen the person who brought them. She had always assumed it was a wandering orc outcast, a silent sympathizer who feared the High King's wrath too much to show their face. She looked at the silver-gray frostbite mark on Kaelin's arm. Ironwood logs were heavy, and the paths up to the limestone caves were steep, jagged, and covered in ice that could destroy a human knee. "Blacksmith," Mora said, her voice dropping into a lower register that made Jory's hands tremble on the bellows. "The Crag Marrow Peaks, the western face where the wind blows from the dead glaciers. Have you ever walked those trails?" Kaelin's hammer did not miss a beat. Tink, tink, clang. "I told you, General," Kaelin said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, though the sweat was pouring down his forehead now, stinging his eyes. "A man with a leg like mine doesn't go walking in the mountains for pleasure. I stay where the ground is flat and the coal is warm." "I did not ask if you went for pleasure," Mora snapped, taking a half-step forward, the floorboards groaning under her leather boots. "A human slave who escapes the ridge mines does not flee south immediately. The border patrols are too thick. The hounds would have caught him in 2 hours. A clever man, a broken man who knows how to hide, would go north, into the peaks, where the orcs themselves fear to tread during the black frost." Kaelin stopped hammering. He left the tool resting flat against the glowing steel of the gauntlet. The metal was cooling now, shifting back from blinding white to a dull, bruised purple. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the anvil, his breathing heavy and regular. "If a man did go into the peaks, General," Kaelin said, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost beneath the sighing of the wind outside the timber walls, "he would have found out very quickly that the only thing more dangerous than the cold was the company. An orc warrior, even a wounded one, doesn't like being seen by a soft skin, especially when that warrior is learning what it feels like to be the one at the bottom of the mountain." He lifted the gauntlet with the tongs and plunged it back into the white fire. A massive cloud of gray steam hissed into the air as the remaining oil on the metal vaporized. Mora stared at his back, her single tusk bared in a silent, complicated grimace of confusion, suspicion, and a strange, sudden weight that felt suspiciously like debt. She looked at his uneven shoulders, his patched tunic, and the mute boy who was now leaning against the bellows support, nearly spent from the exertion. "The gauntlet will take another heat," Kaelin said, his back still turned to her as he adjusted the white coal with an iron poker. "The interior track is straight, but the leather straps need to be replaced. Jory has some old ox hide in the back room. It isn't ceremonial brass, but it'll hold when you swing." Behind them, the oak door of the forge rattled violently. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a heavy, rhythmic pounding, the unmistakable sound of an iron-shod spear butt striking the timber from the outside. A human voice, harsh and thick with the local dialect of the border guards, shouted through the wood. "Vance, open the door! We know you've got the fire lit. The captain wants the horses shod before the snow blocks the ridge road, and we heard there's a green-skinned shadow moving through the lower valley." Jory froze, his eyes darting to Kaelin, his small face turning the color of the ash on the floor. Mora's hand moved instinctively to her left hip, her fingers curling around nothing but empty air where her sword hilt should have been. Her jaw tightened, her yellow eyes narrowing as she prepared herself for the only thing she knew how to do when cornered: die fighting. But Kaelin Vance simply sighed, set his poker rod down carefully against the stone hearth, and looked at the closed door with the patient, tired expression of a man who had been expecting the world to interrupt him all along. The wood of the door didn't just rattle. It vibrated with the malice of men who carried steel and authority. Outside, the horses of the border guard shifted in the deep drifts, their harness chains clinking like small, cold bells against the howling wind. Inside, the silence was absolute, save for the dying hiss of the gauntlet where Kaelin had buried it beneath the white coal. Mora did not move toward the door, nor did she retreat. Her massive frame remained locked in a half-crouch, her one remaining tusk bared, the muscles in her thick thighs tightening until the tattered leather of her campaign trousers strained against the stone-hard muscle. She had no sword, no shield, no armor on her right forearm, but she possessed the violent geometry of a creature who had survived 30 separate tribal skirmishes. She would tear the first throat with her teeth if she had to. Jory looked at Kaelin, his lips moving in a silent, desperate plea, his knuckles white as he held the wooden lever of the bellows as if it were a lifeline. Kaelin Vance did not look at either of them. He reached out with his bare hand, ignoring the searing heat rising from the hearth, and picked up a heavy, soot-stained canvas tarp from the floor. He dropped it over the anvil, covering the glowing, half-finished gauntlet before its distinct, high-ridge silhouette could catch a stray glance. Then he turned his dull gray eyes toward Mora. "The coal bin," Kaelin said. His voice wasn't a whisper, but it had a low, heavy density that somehow went beneath the pounding on the door. "Behind the hearth wall. The ironwood dust is thick enough to choke a horse, but the stone is 3 feet deep. They won't look past the timberline." Mora's yellow eyes flared with sudden, dangerous heat. "An orc of the vanguard does not hide in the dirt like a field rat, human. If your hounds want my blood, let them come and count the cost of the taking." "Your vanguard is 300 miles north, General," Kaelin said, his voice entirely flat, completely unmovable by her pride. He didn't blink. He just stood there, his uneven shoulders slightly dropped, his bad leg dragging as he took one step toward her. "And the men outside aren't looking for a glorious duel. They have crossbows with broadhead bolts dipped in lye. They will stand 20 paces back in the snow and turn you into a pincushion before you can reach the threshold. Hide. Or let the boy watch you die for a word that doesn't belong to you anymore." Mora flinched. The words didn't strike her like an insult. They struck her like a blunt hammer hitting a weak weld. She looked at Kaelin's right wrist, where the pale shackle scars were still visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. She saw the absolute absence of fear in his face. Not the brave bravado of a young warrior, but the cold, hollow certainty of a man who had already looked at his own grave and chosen his terms. Without another word, she turned her massive bulk and stepped into the narrow, pitch-black space behind the heavy stone chimney. The coal bin was deep, filled with the heavy, greasy dust of northern anthracite. The shadows swallowed her broad shoulders until nothing remained but the faint, oily reflection of her single tusk, and then even that vanished into the dark. Kaelin turned toward Jory. "Sit down. Eat your potato." The boy scrambled back to his 3-legged stool, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the salt jar before pulling a shriveled skin of potato to his mouth, forcing himself to chew, though his throat was dry as ash. Kaelin dragged his bad leg across the floor, the heavy, scraped thud sounding unusually loud now that the forge hammer had stopped. He reached the heavy oak door, unlatched the thick iron bar with a deliberate metallic clack, and pulled the timber inward. The winter came in like an invading army. Along with the snow arrived 3 men wrapped in heavy, grease-boiled wool coats over rusted chainmail. The man in the lead was Sergeant Garrick, a veteran of the border skirmishes whose face had been permanently soured by 20 winters of cheap ale and frozen toes. His hand was rested heavily on the pommel of a short sword, his eyes already sweeping the interior of the forge before his boots had even cleared the threshold. "You took your time, Vance," Garrick barked, stamping his boots against the dirt floor, sending clods of frozen mud flying near Jory's stool. A man could freeze to death while you're contemplating your coal. The latch was frozen, Sergeant, Kalen said softly, closing the door behind them and dropping the bar back into place. He didn't look back toward the chimney. He didn't look at the canvas tarp over the anvil. He simply stood by the entrance, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his posture slightly stooped. The wind carries the sleet straight into the iron braces. What does the captain need? Garrick didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the hearth, his heavy nose twitching as he drew in the thick, sulphurous air. He stopped 2 paces from the fire, looking down at the blinding white embers. "That's a hell of a fire for 3 horseshoes, Kalen," Garrick said, his voice dropping into a suspicious, low drawl. He reached out with his gloved hand and poked at the canvas tarp on the anvil. "What are you cooking under here?" Jory stopped chewing. A drop of sweat ran down the boy's temple, leaving a clean white line through the soot on his cheek. Kalen didn't move from the door. "High-density anthracite, Sergeant. The miller's widow broke the axle on her grain wagon yesterday. The iron is old and cold-snapped. If I don't bring the core up to white heat, the weld won't hold the weight of the spring harvest. I can do the captain's horses after the axle cools, but it'll cost an extra 3 coppers for the extra coal." Garrick pulled the canvas tarp back. Beneath it lay nothing but a thick, jagged bar of common pig iron, cold and gray, which Kalen had placed there before the guards arrived, leaving the gauntlet hidden deeper in the hearth dust. The sergeant grunted, clearly disappointed, and let the tarp fall back. He turned his gaze toward the dark corners of the shop, his eyes lingering on the heavy timber columns that held up the roof. "The scouts found tracks 3 miles south of the peace line," Garrick said, leaning his hip against Kalen's workbench. "Big tracks, deep in the snow, wide apart. The kind made by a greenskin who doesn't care who knows she's walking. They say it's that big bitch from the Red Reach siege, the one they stripped of her names." He looked directly at Kalen, his eyes narrowing. "You spent time up north, Vance. You know how they think. If a broken general escapes her own kin's executioners, where does she go?" Kalen looked down at his own bad leg, his gray eyes fixed on the heavy leather boot that encased his ruined knee. "She goes to die, Sergeant," Kalen said, his voice so quiet it seemed to damp the very heat of the room. "An orc without a clan is like a wolf without a pack. They don't look for shelter in human towns. They don't look for pity. They walk into the wind until their blood turns to ice, because they don't know any other way to stop being angry." Garrick watched him for a long, heavy moment. The suspicious edge in the sergeant's eyes slowly gave way to something else, a standard human mix of pity and faint disgust. To Garrick, Kalen Vance was just a broken remnant of the old wars, a man whose spirit had been hammered out of him in the northern pits, leaving nothing but a compliant, half-dead blacksmith who mended plows for coppers. "Aye," Garrick muttered, turning back toward the door. "I suppose they do. Nasty beasts. Don't even have the sense to beg when they're beaten." He reached for the door latch, then stopped, looking back at the mute boy on the stool. "Tell the lad to stop staring like that, Kalen. Makes him look simpler than he is." "Have the captain's horses ready by noon tomorrow, or we'll find another smith who doesn't charge for the extra coal." "They'll be ready, Sergeant," Kalen said. He lifted the iron bar. The 3 guards stepped back out into the freezing dark, their cloaks snapping like whips in the blizzard, and the door closed once more. The metallic clack of the latch dropping home felt like the final note of a song that everyone had held their breath to finish. For a full minute, nobody moved. The wind howled against the timber walls, the only sound in the forge besides the heavy, wet gasps of Jory finally letting his breath go. Then, from the absolute blackness behind the stone chimney, a massive shape shifted. The coal dust rattled down the stone face as Mora stepped back into the red glow of the dying hearth. Her tattered cloak was covered in fine, black soot, her skin looking even darker, almost bruised in the firelight. She did not look at the door. She did not look at Jory. She walked straight to the anvil, pulled back the canvas tarp, and stared down at the gray bar of pig iron Kaelin had used to trick her enemies. "You lied to your own kind," Mora said. Her voice was lower now, missing the sharp military command from before, replaced by a strange, heavy confusion that seemed to grate against her tusk. "For an orc. For a disgraced general who would have burned this valley to the ground 3 summers ago if the High King had ordered it." Kaelin Vance dragged his bad leg back to the hearth, picked up his long tongs, and reached deep into the white coal, pulling the liquid glowing gauntlet back out onto the anvil. "I didn't lie for a general, Mora," Kaelin said, his short, rounding hammer already hovering over the hot steel. "I lied for the woman who spent 3 winters in a limestone cave because she wouldn't let her brother see her beg." He looked up at her, his gray eyes catching the white luminescence of the high ridge iron. "Now sit down," he said. "The steel is losing its heat, and we have a long way to go before the noon bell." The white light of the hearth slowly faded, leaving behind the deep, blood-red glow of dying embers. The blinding heat receded, allowing the biting chill of the border winter to seep back through the cracks in the timber walls. On the anvil, the gauntlet had finally taken its true shape. The crushed steel plates were straight again, the articulation tracks realigned so perfectly that the heavy metal segments slid over one another with a smooth, fluid hiss rather than a grinding screech. It was no longer a piece of broken scrap. It was once again a weapon of the vanguard. Kaelin Vance set his rounding hammer down on the stone floor with a dull thud. His right hand was trembling, a fine, involuntary shudder brought on by hours of holding heavy iron against the vibration of the anvil. He didn't try to hide the tremor. He simply reached for a thick square of cured oxhide Jory had brought from the back room before the boy had finally collapsed into sleep, curled up on a pile of burlap sacks near the coal bin. Kaelin sat down on a low wooden bench, dragging his ruined leg out straight before him. He picked up a short, curved leather knife and began to slice the oxhide into thick, sturdy straps to replace the burned remains on the gauntlet. Mora did not sit. She remained standing by the cooling forge, her massive green hand resting on the stone mantel. She looked down at Kaelin, her yellow eyes tracking the slow, methodical movement of his blade through the leather. The anger that had defined her presence since she crossed the threshold had completely vanished, replaced by a heavy, brooding curiosity. "You speak of the Cragmarrow Peaks as if you only watched them from a distance, Blacksmith," Mora said, her voice dropping into the quiet, rhythmic cadence of the room. "But a man does not learn the path to the limestone caves by looking through a merchant's glass, and he does not get silver-gray frostbite marks on his forearm by sitting beside a warm hearth." Kaelin didn't look up from the leather. Screech! The knife cut through the tough hide with a clean, deliberate stroke. "The wind up there doesn't care who you are, General," Kaelin muttered. "It freezes the king's blood just as fast as the slaves. If a man was up there, he was just trying to find wood that wasn't frozen through. Nothing more." Mora stepped closer, the floorboards barely whispering under her weight this time. She stopped right at the edge of his bench, looking down at his rolled-up sleeves. The red glow of the embers caught the deep, cross-hatched shackle scars on his wrists, the brutal reminder of his years in the iron mines. But her gaze lingered longer on the faint, circular silver patch lower on his arm. "Why do you hide your scars?" Mora asked. It was the first time she had asked a question without the armor of a command. Her voice held the blunt, heavy weight of an orc trying to understand a creature made of softer material. "In the clans, a warrior wears his scars on the outside. We braid our hair around the cuts. We show the lineage of our pain so the world knows exactly what it took to break us and what we survived. But you You pull your sleeves down the moment the guards knock. You bury your history in the soot. Kalen stopped the knife. He let the blade rest against the dark ox hide, his gray eyes remaining fixed on the grain of the wood beneath the leather. Because in my world, General, a scar isn't a trophy, Kalen said softly, his voice carrying the exhaustion of 40 winters. It's just a reminder of the day you weren't fast enough, or strong enough, or smart enough to avoid the hammer. The guards outside don't look at these shackle marks and see a survivor.
They see a piece of property that belonged to the enemy. They see a man who might have learned to look at an orc without wanting to spit. He turned his arm slightly, the silver frostbite mark catching the dim red light. And some scars don't belong to the man who wears them. They belong to the choice he made. If you show them to the world, people start asking what the choice was worth. And that's a dangerous arithmetic in a place like this. Mora stared at the silver mark. Her mind raced back to those 3 bitter winters in the cave, the freezing dark, the infected wounds that felt like molten lead in her joints, and the silent, anonymous bundles of ironwood that appeared through the blizzards. She looked at Kalen's thin, uneven shoulders, his dragging leg, and the trembling of his fingers as he picked the knife back up. She knew the weight of ironwood. She knew that carrying a single log up those icy, wind-blasted Cragmarrow trails would have been torture for a whole man. For a man with a shattered knee, it would have been a slow, agonizing crawl through the jaws of death itself. Yet she still couldn't fully comprehend it. Why would an escaped human slave, a man who had every reason to watch the Orc nation bleed to death in the snow, risk his hard-won freedom, his flesh, and his very life to carry wood to a disgraced, dying general of the vanguard? He didn't know her name then. He couldn't have known she would survive to become a commander. There was no profit in it, no glory, no blood debt that could ever be enforced. "You are a strange creature, Kalen Vance," Mora whispered, her single tusk casting a long, sharp shadow down her chin. "You have the hands of a master, the spine of a captive, and the secrets of a ghost." "I'm just a blacksmith, Mora," Kalen said, his voice dropping into that final, flat rhythm as he punched the first rivet hole into the new leather strap. "And right now, the only thing that matters is getting this leather stitched before the captain comes looking for his horses." He lifted the heavy gauntlet from the anvil, the cold steel ringing softly in the quiet forge, and held it out toward her. The steel did not protest as Mora slid her forearm into the dark sleeve of the gauntlet. It was a sound that had no place in a human village, a heavy, sliding shk of perfectly articulated plates passing over one another, followed by the soft, solid thud of the wrist guard locking into the forearm channel. For 3 weeks, her arm had been a mass of swollen, purple flesh where the collapsed plates had bitten into the muscle. Now, as the new oxhide strap settled against her skin, the relief was instantaneous. The metal didn't press, it cradled. It felt less like armor and more like an extension of her own bone. Mora turned her wrist. She flexed her massive fingers, closing them into a fist that could have shattered a horse's spine. The plates moved in perfect synchronization, the high ridge ore catching the low crimson light of the dying forge fire. Kalen Vance did not watch her celebrate the fit. He remained seated on the low wooden bench, his head bowed, using a piece of rough pumice stone to clean the grease from his fingers. His breath came in slow, shallow counts, his chest hitching slightly every time he leaned forward. The long hours of working the white fire had taken their toll. The grayness in his skin was deeper now, the hollows beneath his cheekbones dark as the coal dust in the corners of the shop. "The alignment is correct," Mora said, her voice dropping into the quiet dark of the room like a heavy stone. She held her arm up, staring at the clean, unadorned leather straps Kalen had stitched. The armorer who forged this spent 3 moons adjusting the counterweights so the vanguard blade wouldn't pull the shoulder out of socket during a mounted charge. You corrected the track in 4 hours with nothing but a rounding hammer and a common anvil. Kalen didn't look up. He rubbed the pumice against his palm, the dry, scraping sound filling the space between them. The ore wants to be straight, General. Metal has a memory, just like people. If you hit it where the stress is buried, it does most of the clearing itself. You just have to know where the weld is tired. Mora didn't accept the deflection. She took a slow step toward his workbench, her yellow eyes fixed on the array of tools spread across the oil-stained pine. There were punches of varying sizes, short-handled chisels, and a heavy, double-faced flattening hammer that looked as old as the foundations of the town. But her gaze stopped on a small, rusted iron awl used for boring holes into thick leather. The tool itself was ordinary, the tip dulled by years of pushing through cured hide, but the handle, the wooden grip, had cracked long ago, and someone had repaired it by wrapping it tightly with a thin, 3-strand braided cord. The cord was made from hemp and dried pine bast, dyed a dark, muddy green using the crushed needles of the northern ironwood tree to keep the fibers from rotting in the damp air of a forge. Mora's single tusk bared slightly as she reached out her left hand. Her thick fingers hovered over the tool, but she didn't pick it up. She couldn't. Her hand was trembling, the green skin turning pale at the knuckles. She recognized the braid. It wasn't a common human knot, nor was it the standard wrap used by the merchant caravans. It was a specific, defensive reverse twist, a knot taught only to the labor captives in the deep iron mines of the Broken Ridge clan to secure the heavy ore sacks to the transport sleds. A knot designed to hold under immense weight, tied by hands that had forgotten what it felt like to hold anything but chain. And 3 winters ago, in the freezing desolation of the Cragmarrow Peaks, every single bundle of ironwood that had appeared outside her dying cave had been bound tight with that exact same green, 3-strand pine bast cord. Mora turned slowly, the heavy plates of her gauntlet ringing out a single sharp note in the quiet room. She looked down at Kalen Vance, at his uneven shoulders, his dragging leg, and the pale cross-hatched shackle marks on his wrist that he had pulled his sleeve down to hide once more. "The wood," she whispered. The low rumble of her voice was gone, replaced by a raw, hollow sound that seemed to scrape against the back of her throat. "The ironwood logs at the mouth of the cave, the ones that arrived when the black frost was splitting the stone." Kalen stopped rubbing the pumice. His hands went entirely still in his lap. He didn't look up at her face. He kept his eyes on the dirt floor between his boots, his gray gaze fixed on a stray shaving of oxhide. "Wood is just wood, Mora," Kalen said softly, his voice dropping into that flat, unyielding rhythm that refused to carry emotion. "The mountains are full of trees. The wind knocks them down, and the melt carries them into the draws. A man looking for scrap doesn't keep track of where the branches fall." "Do not lie to me, human," Mora growled, taking a massive step forward that caused the floorboards beneath the dirt to groan in protest. She dropped to one knee before his bench, bringing her scarred face level with his. Her yellow eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terrifying, ancient weight. "An escaped slave with a shattered knee does not wander into the Cragmarrow trails during the Black Frost by accident. He does not carry 60 pounds of ironwood up an icy glacier draw just to see if the wind will blow it into a hole in the rock." She reached out, her massive, gauntleted hand curling around his right wrist, her fingers pressing gently but firmly against the pale shackle scars. "Every bundle was tied with the ridge twist," she said, her breath fogging between them, smelling of wet iron and old pine sap. "Every jar of needle lard was sealed with the same forged tarp wax you used to cover your anvil. I was the general who ordered the vanguard to clear the valley 3 summers before you broke your chains.
My kin burned your crops. My soldiers drove your people into the mud. Why did you carry the wood, Kaelin?" Kaelin Vance looked at her hand on his wrist. He didn't pull away. He didn't look afraid. The dull gray of his eyes seemed to widen, absorbing the red glow of the remaining embers until he looked like a man standing at the edge of a great forest during a fire. "Because you weren't a general in that cave, Mora," Kaelin said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it held the weight of bedrock beneath a frozen river. "You were just a creature that had been left on the stone to die. I spent 4 winters in the ridge pits watching your clan elders measure the children. I watched them look at the small ones, the ones with the cracked teeth or the thin bones, and I watched them carry them out to the ridge for the crows because the math didn't work for the vanguard." He thinned his lips, his gaze drifting past her shoulder toward the sleeping boy, Jory, whose small chest rose and fell in the shadows. "When I broke my chains and went north into the peaks, I found that cave. I saw the tracks. I saw the blood in the snow where you had dragged your leg through the drifts. And I saw the right side of your jaw, where the tusk had been sheared away by your own brother's iron." He looked back into her yellow eyes, his voice steady, flat, and absolute. "I didn't carry the wood to save a warlord, Mora. I carried the wood because I wanted the elders on the ridge to be wrong. I wanted the piece of iron they threw into the dirt to be the one that survived the winter. There's no blood debt in that. There's no alliance. It was just a cold night, and the fire shouldn't have gone out." Mora stared at him, her hands slowly loosening around his wrist. The silence that followed was different from any silence they had shared before. It wasn't the silence of enemies, or of a smith and a customer. It was the vast, heavy silence that falls across a battlefield after the banners have fallen, and the survivors realize they are looking at the only other person who knows what the night cost. Outside, the first pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the frost on the forge window, turning the snowdrifts into mounds of cold salt. The blizzard had finally run out of road, but the noon bell was coming, and with it, the 3 guards and their horses. The gray dawn did not bring light to the valley. It merely turned the darkness into a heavy, leaden mist that hung low over the snowdrifts. The storm had left behind a bitter, biting frost that crystallized the sulfur smoke hanging near the rafters of the forge, turning the soot into tiny, shimmering needles of black ice. Kaelin Vance did not rest. His hands, still stained dark with leather grease and charcoal, picked up the long iron rasp. His bad leg dragged with a heavy, predictable scrape thud as he walked around the perimeter of the forge, checking the window shutters, ensuring the heavy oak bar on the door was seated deep within its iron brackets. The noon bell was still hours away, but in the borderlands, time did not move by the clock. It moved by the sound of approaching hooves. On the floor near the coal bin, Jory stirred. The boy sat up, shaking the burlap sacks from his thin shoulders, his eyes immediately darting to the hearth. When he saw Mora still standing there, no longer a crouching predator in the dark, but a massive silhouette outlined by the cold dawn, his small frame went rigid. But the fear was different now. He saw the gauntlet on her arm. He saw the clean oxhide straps Kaelin had cut from his own small reserve. Mora did not look at the boy. She stood by the workbench, her left hand slowly tracing the edge of the anvil. The steel plates on her right arm caught the pale light coming through the high slats in the wall, looking clean, functional, and devoid of the vanity her people usually demanded. There were no clan marks left on her armor. The silver pieces she had placed on the table remained exactly where she had left them. Kaelin had not touched them. "The horse iron," Mora said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the stone floor itself. "The guards will be here when the sun reaches the ridge line. You have 3 mounts to shoe, Blacksmith. A whole man would have the coals hot by now."
Kalen dropped a handful of standard pig iron shoes onto the dirt floor with a loud metallic clatter. A whole man would have left this valley 12 winters ago, General. I work at the speed the bone allows. He reached for the leather bellows lever himself, but before his fingers could close around the smooth ashwood handle, a massive green hand slid past his shoulder, covering the wood. Mora did not push him aside. She simply took the weight of the lever into her own grip. The heavy plates of her gauntlet clicked smoothly as her fingers closed around the handle. "The boy is small," Mora said, looking down at Jory, who was now standing by the coal bin, his hands tucked into his sleeves. "His lungs are full of ash from your fire. I will blow the hearth." Kalen looked at her hand on the lever, then up at her scarred face. The sheared tusk on the right side of her jaw was a dull gray in the dawn light, the skin around the wound tight and puckered. "An Orc General doesn't work the bellows for a human smith," Kalen said, his voice retaining that flat, unyielding rhythm. "If the Vanguard elders saw you now, they'd strip the remaining tusk from your mouth before the noon bell." "The Vanguard is dead to me, Vance," Mora growled low, her yellow eyes narrowing as she pulled the lever down in one smooth, explosive motion. The leather expanded with a heavy, rushing sigh, and the red core of the hearth instantly flared back into life, casting long, dancing shadows across the stone walls. "And the elders are 300 miles away, counting their dead at the Red Reach walls. They do not know the temperature of this room." Kalen didn't argue. He picked up his long tongs, grabbed a cold horseshoe from the dirt, and thrust it deep into the rising flame. For the next 2 hours, the forge returned to the ancient language of work. There was no poetry in it, no grand declarations of peace between two warring species. There was only the clang, tink, tink of the hammer against the shoe, the steady rush of air from the bellows Mora worked with tireless, rhythmic strength, and the silent, quick movements of Jory as he fetched the square iron nails from the storage jars. But as the morning wore on, the heat of the forge began to reveal what the darkness of the night had hidden. Every time Kalen lifted the heavy 3-pound turning hammer, his breath came with a faint, wet rattle deep inside his chest. It wasn't the sudden cough of a child fighting a winter cold. It was the dry, shallow whistling of lungs that had spent too many years breathing the stone dust of the deep northern iron mines. When he swung, his uneven shoulders dipped lower than they should have, his left knee locking completely to bear the strain of his weight. Mora watched him from behind the hearth wall. With her military eye, she didn't just see a man working. She saw a structure that was slowly, systematically coming apart under its own load. She saw the way his right hand would occasionally freeze mid-air, the fingers locking around the hammer handle for a fraction of a second before his will forced them to move again. She looked from his locked hand to the silver frostbite patch on his forearm, and then down to the shackle scars that ringed his wrists like iron collars. "The bone rot," Mora said suddenly, her voice cutting through the steady cadence of his strikes. Kalen didn't stop the hammer. Clang, tink, clang. "It has a human name, General," Kalen said between swings. "The miners call it the gray lung. The stone gets into the meat of the chest, and after a few winters, the air doesn't find the blood anymore. It's a common illness in the north." "It is not common," Mora snapped, letting the bellows lever rise slowly. The fire dimmed slightly, the bright orange light softening into a dark, bruised red. "It is what happens when a slave works the lower drifts without a tallow filter over his mouth. The overseers used it to quiet the stubborn ones. 2 winters in the wet stone, and the spine doesn't want to stand straight anymore." She stepped out from behind the chimney, her massive bulk casting a shadow that covered both Kalen and the anvil. "You did not get this from the mines alone, Vance," she said, her yellow eyes boring into his gray ones. "The gray lung takes 10 winters to kill a whole man. But if that man spends his nights carrying iron wood up the glacier trails,
If he breathes the black frost air while his lungs are already full of stone, the rot speeds up. It takes the marrow. Kalen set his hammer down on the face of the anvil. The iron gave off a low, vibrating hum that died out slowly in the cold air. He didn't pull his sleeve down this time. He just stood there, his breath rattling behind his ribs, his thin chest heaving against the burned wool of his tunic. "The wood had to get up the mountain, Mora," Kalen said softly, his voice dropping into that quiet, bedrock certainty. "The wind wasn't going to carry it." "Why?" Mora asked again, the word coming out of her chest like a blow. Her gauntleted fist struck the side of the anvil, the steel ringing out a terrible, clear note. "I was the enemy. I was the hand that held the whip before the High King broke my name. If I had died in that cave, the border would have been safer for your town. The guards outside would have had one less shadow to hunt. Why give your lungs for a greenskin who didn't even know your face?" Kalen Vance looked at the massive Orc General kneeling before his history. He didn't look at her with anger or with the pride of a martyr. He looked at her with the deep, exhausted patience of a man who had already answered the question in his own heart long before the fire had been lit tonight. "Because the line someone drew on a map doesn't change the color of the blood on the stone, General," Kalen said. He reached down, his scarred fingers touching the small, mute boy's head as Jory stepped closer to his side. "And because, when I was in the pits, there was an orc woman who stood by the transport gate. She didn't use the whip. When the guards weren't looking, she dropped the extra salt skins into the dirt near the shovel line so the slaves wouldn't lose their teeth to the scurvy. She didn't say her name. She didn't ask for thanks. She just did it because the math of the overseers was ugly to her." Mora's breath stopped. Her single tusk twitched violently, her yellow eyes widening until the red veins within them looked like tiny, shattered lines of stone. "You," she whispered. "The gate guard at the 4th Drift." "You wore the vanguard brass then, Mora," Kalen said, his gray eyes steady as iron. "Your right tusk was still whole, but the scars on your jawline were the same. I remembered the shape of the asking." From the distance, through the heavy timber walls of the forge, the low, metallic sound of the town's noon bell began to ring. 1, 2, 3. Along with the sound of the bell came the distinct, rhythmic crunch of multiple horses moving through the deep snowdrifts outside, their iron shoes striking the hidden stones of the ridge road with a cold, relentless clarity. The iron-shod hooves outside did not stop at the hitching post. They came straight to the soft, trampled snow outside the forge door, the horses panting in heavy white plumes that rose past the frosted window slats. Inside, the fire was a low, sullen red, suppressed by the damp air Kalen had forced into the charcoal to hide the bright white glare of the high ridge embers. Mora did not move back to the deep dark of the coal bin. She stood perfectly still, her massive hand still resting near the ashwood lever of the bellows, her yellow eyes fixed on Kalen's face. The revelation of the 4th Drift hung between them like a heavy sheet of unpolished iron, rough, cold, and permanent. She had spent years believing her survival in the cave was a solitary miracle, a sign from the spirits that her broken body was meant for the vanguard stone. Now, the math had changed. Her glory had been bought with the marrow of a human slave who remembered the flavor of dropped salt. "They are at the threshold," Mora whispered, the metal plates of her repaired gauntlet giving off a faint metallic hum as she tightened her fist. "The sergeant is not a patient man, Kalen. If he smells the northern ore on the anvil, he will not leave this room without drawing steel." Kalen Vance did not answer with words. He reached down, grabbed a thick handful of cold slag dust from the trough, and threw it directly onto the core of the hearth. A foul-smelling, dark gray smoke billowed upward,
instantly choking the clean sulfur scent and coating the rafters in a fresh layer of dull grime. He looked at Jory, pointing a scarred finger toward the rear storage door. "Take the oxhide scraps. Sit in the leather loft. Do not come down until the shoes are set." The mute boy nodded, his eyes wide with an old, familiar terror, and scrambled up the creaking wooden ladder into the dark rafters above the storage room, disappearing into the smell of cured grease. Kalen dragged his bad leg toward the door, the scrape thud slower now, more deliberate, as if each movement required a separate command from his brain. The wet rattle in his chest was louder after the smoke took the room, a sharp whistling hitch that he caught behind his teeth every time he inhaled. He lifted the heavy oak bar. The door swung back and the border winter pushed Sergeant Garrick inside for the second time that day. Behind the sergeant stood two younger guards, their faces blue beneath their iron caps, holding the reins of three massive, short-backed cavalry mounts. The beasts were lathered in sweat despite the freezing air, their coats crusting with salt along the flanks. They were heavy, dangerous animals, bred for the rocky paths of the ridge road where a slipped shoe meant a broken rider. "Noon, Vance," Garrick said, stepping into the forge without wiping his boots, his gray eyes instantly scanning the layout of the room, stopping for a brief second on the heavy canvas tarp that still covered the anvil. "The road through the lower draw is already shifting. The ice is coming down from the peaks. If these mounts aren't shod before the frost locks the stone, the captain will have us patrolling the line on foot." "The irons are ready, Sergeant," Kalen said softly, his voice flat, dry, and entirely devoid of the weight he had carried moments before. He stepped aside, letting the guards lead the first beast, a broad-chested roan stallion with a vicious eye, into the shallow shoeing stall near the forge chimney. As the stallion entered the stall, its nostrils flared. The beast gave a sudden violent snort, its front hooves striking the dirt floor, its ears flattening against its skull. It wasn't the smell of the fire that frightened the animal. It was the smell of the coal bin. The faint, musk-heavy scent of an Orc General who had spent 20 years in campaign leather was still thick in the damp air behind the stone mantel. The young guard holding the reins cursed, pulling the chain lead tight. "Whoa! Steady, you brute!" "The smoke's got him riled, Kalen. What did you burn in here, a dead dog?" "Old horn shavings, lad," Kalen muttered, dragging his leg to the tool trough and picking up the heavy paring knife and the hoof nippers. "The coal was damp from the sleet. I used the scrap horn from the tanner's yard to dry the embers. The horses don't like the stink, but it settles when the iron hits the frog." Mora stood 3 feet away, separated from the horse's head by nothing but a single layer of unmortared river stones that formed the back wall of the chimney. She could hear the stallion's heavy breathing through the rock. She could hear the scratch of Kalen's boots as he dropped to one knee beside the animal's front flank. With his left knee locked straight out behind him to balance his uneven weight, Kalen leaned his shoulder against the roan's leg, lifting the heavy, cracked hoof into his lap. The work of a bordersmith was brutal on a whole spine. For Kalen, it was a slow execution. As he dug the paring knife into the overgrown horn of the hoof, clearing the frozen mud and the dead tissue, the muscles in his forearm flexed. The shackle scars on his wrist were fully exposed to the gray light of the doorway. Sergeant Garrick walked over, standing directly above Kalen, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his short sword. He wasn't watching the horse. He was watching the smith. "The scouts came back from the lower ford an hour ago, Vance," Garrick said, his voice dropping into that casual, dangerous tone that bordermen used before they made an arrest. "They found a dead scout wolf in the brush, one of ours. The throat wasn't cut by a blade. It was broken by a hand. A big hand. The kind that leaves green skin oil on the fur." Kalen didn't stop the knife. Screech! The thin ribbon of horn peeled away under his blade, smelling of old stable rot and cold iron. "The wolves get old, Sergeant," Kalen said, his breath hitching as he spoke, the wet rattle in his chest making the words tremble slightly at the edges. They get slow. If a wild bear came down from the peaks looking for carrion, a scout wolf wouldn't stand much of a chance in the deep drifts. It wasn't a bear, Kalen, Garrick said, his boot heel coming down within 3 inches of Kalen's ruined knee, and the track led straight down the ridge road toward the lower valley, right past the timberline of this shop. He leaned down slightly, the smell of cheap tobacco and stale ale rising from his coat. You were a smith for the vanguard before you broke out, weren't you? That's what the old ledgers in the capital say. A slave smith for the 4th drift. Kalen stopped the knife. He kept his shoulder pressed hard against the roan stallion's flank, the beast's weight heavy against his thin frame. He lifted his head slowly, his dull gray eyes meeting the sergeant's sharp, suspicious gaze. I was a slave, Sergeant, Kalen said, his voice dropping into that quiet, absolute bedrock rhythm. I didn't choose the shop. I didn't choose the masters. I carried the iron they gave me, and when the guards got drunk during the Black Frost, I walked south until my leg gave out. If there's a shadow moving through this valley, it didn't ask my permission to use the road. Garrick stared at him for a long, suffocating minute. The young guards in the background held their breath, the only sound in the forge being the rhythmic, heavy snorting of the stallion and the faint, distant whistling deep within Kalen's lungs. Then, Garrick straightened up, a cold, hard smile touching his thin lips. Aye, the sergeant said, turning back toward the door. I suppose you didn't. But if we find out you've been mending more than horse iron in this forge, Vance, the captain won't send you back to the pits. He'll save the northern clan the cost of the rope. He pointed a finger at the remaining 2 mounts outside. Get the shoes on the roan. We'll wait in the saddle until the work is done. The frost is coming down fast, and I don't want to be in this valley when the dark falls. The door didn't close this time. The guards stayed on the threshold, their heavy wool cloaks blocking the gray daylight, their eyes remaining fixed on the broken man who knelt in the soot, his hammer already rising for the first nail. The sound of the hammer hitting the horseshoe nail was different now. It lacked the crisp, metallic resonance of the morning. Each strike was a dull, heavy thud, vibrating through Kalen's frail frame and burying itself straight into his locked joints. Thud. Tink. Thud. The roan stallion shifted its immense weight, its dark flank pressing hard against Kalen's uneven shoulders. Sweat poured from Kalen's brow, cutting pale tracks through the thick layer of soot on his face. His left leg, stiff as an unyielding pine timber, groaned under the pressure as he forced his locked knee to hold the beast's rear hoof securely between his thighs. Every breath he drew from the smoky air of the forge came with an agonizing, wet whistle. The gray lung was no longer a distant ache behind his ribs. It was a fire, eating away at the remaining fabric of his chest. Yet his hands remained absolute. His scarred fingers handled the square iron nails with the flawless precision of a master who had forgotten how to make a mistake. At the open threshold, Sergeant Garrick stood with his arms crossed over his rusted chainmail, his eyes tracking the rhythmic rise and fall of Kalen's arm. Behind him, the 2 younger guards stayed mounted, their figures silhouetted against the blinding white glare of the border snowdrifts. They didn't speak. The only sounds in the valley were the howling of the ridge wind, the restless snorting of the horses, and the slow, systematic destruction of Kalen Vance's lungs. Behind the low chimney wall of unmortared river stones, Mora stood in the absolute dark of the coal bin. She did not breathe. Her massive green ears, trained to map the movement of enemy archers through the brush, listened to every micro-movement on the other side of the rock. She could hear the distinct, heavy rasp of the iron file clearing the hoof wall. She could hear the faint, wet rattle inside Kalen's chest every time he leaned down. And more than anything,
She could hear the silent, terrifying architecture of a human being systematically killing himself to keep 3 guards from looking behind a stone mantle. The realization settled into her bones like frost. Every strike of Kalen's hammer wasn't just shoeing a guard's mount. It was the slow spending of the years he had stolen from the northern mines. He was burning his own marrow to pay a debt she had never asked for, a debt born from a few dropped salt skins at the 4th drift 6 winters ago. Suddenly, the second mount, a temperamental gray mare tied to the iron ring outside the stall, reared back violently. Her iron bit clinked sharply against her teeth as she caught another stray scent from the chimney draw. The young guard holding her reins cursed loudly, his boots sliding through the muck as the mare's front hooves struck the timber post. "Vance!" Garrick barked, his hand immediately dropping back to the hilt of his short sword. "The beasts are getting wilder by the minute. There's something in the wind today, Smith. They smell blood. Or they smell a greenskin." Kalen did not drop the roan's hoof. He finished driving the 4th nail, his rounding hammer snapping the long tip off with a clean, singular twist of his wrist. He let the leg drop, dragging his own ruined limb behind him as he turned to face the sergeant. A thin, dark line of blood was beginning to ooze from the corner of Kalen's lip, mixed with the black dust of the anthracite. He didn't wipe it away. He kept his gray eyes flat, dull, and entirely unmovable. "The mare's young, Sergeant," Kalen said, his voice dropping into that familiar, quiet, bedrock rhythm, though it was hollower now, missing the air required to hold the volume. "She's never smelled the ironwood horn before. If your guard keeps pulling the chain lead like that, he's going to break her jaw before the iron is set. Bring her into the center stall, away from the chimney draw." Garrick stared at the blood on Kalen's mouth. His eyes narrowed, his military suspicion flaring once more as he looked from the smith's face down to the canvas tarp over the anvil, and then toward the dark corners where the coal bins sat. "You're spitting black, Vance," Garrick said, his voice low, measured, and dangerous. "That look doesn't come from damp coal. That's the northern rot, the kind the slave catchers bring back from the deep drifts." "It's the forge, Sergeant," Kalen muttered, picking up the heavy turning tongs and grabbing the final shoe for the mare from the cooling embers. 40 years of breathing the scale off the iron. It takes the throat first. Then it takes the rest. If you want the captain's mounts ready before the ice closes the draw, I suggest you let me finish the iron instead of measuring my spit." The silence that followed was thin enough to cut. Garrick took a slow step forward, his heavy leather boot coming down right on the pale shaving of oxhide Kalen had dropped earlier. He looked into the black space behind the hearth wall, his fingers tightening around the leather wrap of his sword pommel. He was a veteran. He knew when a room was hiding a shadow. Behind the stone, Mora's fingers closed around the edge of the mantle. The high-ridged steel of her gauntlet did not creak, but the river stone beneath her palm began to flake, the ancient mortar turning to dust under the immense pressure of her grip. If the sergeant took one more step, if his eyes caught the tattered edge of her vanguard cloak, she would not wait to be pinned by crossbows. She would bring the entire stone chimney down on his head and die in the collapse. But before Garrick could move, a small sudden sound echoed from the high rafters above the storage room. Thud. A heavy square of cured oxhide fell from the leather loft, landing squarely on the dirt floor between the sergeant and the stall. Garrick spun around, his short sword clearing the scabbard with a sharp metallic hiss. The 2 guards at the door raised their short bows, their eyes darting up into the darkness of the timber ceiling. "Who's up there?" Garrick roared. Kalen Vance didn't flinch. He walked forward, his bad leg dragging with that heavy, agonizing scrape thud, and picked up the dropped piece of hide. He looked up into the dark rafters where Jory was hidden, his voice flat and stern. "I told you to stack the hide tight, boy," Kalen called out into the dark, his voice steady despite the rattling behind his ribs.
The frost shrinks the leather. If you let the bundles slip again, you'll be mending the harness straps in the snow tonight." He turned back to Garrick, holding out the stiff square of oxhide. "It's just the mute lad, Sergeant. His hands get clumsy when the cold takes the fingers. He's been up there sorting the winter reserves since dawn." Garrick looked at the leather, then up at the dark loft, his breathing heavy. The tension in his shoulders slowly drained away, replaced by the bitter irritation of a man who had been made to jump by a ghost. He slammed his short sword back into its scabbard with an angry clatter. "Stupid boy," the sergeant muttered, turning back toward the door and wiping the frost from his beard. "Get the mare shod, Kalen. 5 minutes. If the shoes aren't set by then, we're leaving with what we have." 5 minutes is all the iron needs, Sergeant," Kalen said. He turned his back on the doorway, his gray eyes catching the faint reflection of the dying fire. He did not look at the chimney wall where Mora was hidden, but as he lifted the heavy paring knife to begin the final hoof, his right sleeve slipped back 3 inches, exposing the cross-hatched shackle marks and the silver frostbite patch to the cold, unforgiving gray dawn. Outside, the noon bell finished its final toll, its echoes dying out across the frozen white landscape, leaving nothing but the sound of the hammer falling once more into the dirt.